In 2005, the reality TV show Three Wishes aired, and it aired for one season. The aim of the producers of the show was to provide those who were from small-town America an opportunity to express their wish, their one wish that they would love to have granted. And the producers had said, the money is no object. We'll provide whatever it is. That they were looking for these heartwarming stories. Stories where they would find individuals who were needy, who were self-sacrificing, and who really needed some lift me up or pick me up. And in producing the show, the story would go through the fulfillment of these three wishes, carrying out the desires of these people who had sacrificed so much and yet who were so needy. Now, there's something to be said that when you produce a reality TV show and you say, any wish we will fulfill and no cost is involved, there's a reason those shows only last one season, right? There's a reason it doesn't last. While the show was heartwarming and while it was fascinating, it couldn't be sustained. A lack of wisdom on the producer's part meant that there just was an inability to carry on the show. If you could ask for one thing, what would you ask for? Now, before you answer that, it's easy to rush forward and to say, I know exactly what I would ask for. But the implications of that decision of asking for one thing can be incredibly, not only life-changing, but detrimental. You may receive something that's really great initially, but find that that one thing that you asked for undermines you. And so you'd want to give a lot of thought to whatever you would ask for. That whatever you would ask for, that you would have it be something that was lasting, that would have an impact, that could leave a legacy, that could make a difference. And what we find in 1 Kings 3 is the story of one man's request that did leave a lasting legacy and impact for all of eternity. Now, as we pick up the story of everything, we need to just refresh ourselves from where we began. We've been going through this great story, the story of the Bible. We believe that God's work is done in history, and so therefore we can trace it through God's work through history from beginning to end. And we began with last September, starting in the Garden of Eden, the God who created, putting one man and one woman in union with each other and with Him, living in perfect harmony in the perfect temple of Eden. But instead of ruling as prophet, priest, and king, Adam failed in his task and ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and was kicked out of the garden along with his wife because he had listened to the serpent who had defiled the garden, who had come in with evil intentions. And instead of slaying the serpent and being the protector of the kingdom of the holy place, Adam failed. And so banished from the garden, God began His process of redeeming humanity and rescuing them. He began with a man named Abraham, promising him that He would give him a great name, that He would give him a great land, and that He would give him a great future with a great family. And so as Abraham had a child, and that child had many more children, what we find is that by the time we get to the book of Exodus, this man Abraham, who had received these promises, has numerous descendants, but they have been enslaved in Egypt. And being enslaved, God hears the cries of this people that He is going to use to bring about His redemption to the world. And in redeeming them, He brings them out of bondage and slavery by this man Moses. But they no sooner get out of the house of bondage and slavery than they get into the wilderness and begin to grumble and complain. Though God had rescued them miraculously, they complain against God. God brings them to His holy mountain, Mount Sinai, and says, I want to teach you, though, how to live. I want you to live as free people, not as bound slaves. And so He gives them His law, and in giving them His law, He instructs them in the ways that they should go. However, instead of following God and following His ways, the people grumble and complain even when they come back to the land that God had promised to give Abraham, this great land. Now that they're more numerous than the stars of the sky and the sand on the seashore, they grumble and they complain. And so they wander in the wilderness for 40 years until Moses dies and finally a new generation enters into that land. But instead of following God's commands, and dealing with the evil in the land, the people continue in their own path and in their own way. And by doing that, what they find is that evil perpetuates in this land. Just like Adam did not deal with the evil that was in the land, Israel doesn't deal with evil in the land until there is one man who comes along and he deals with things decisively. His name is David. We ended back in June with the story of David, who is this great king. He is prosperous and successful. He settles the kingdom, but he himself is not the one who leads God's people into victory. He himself is a sinner. But God had promised that he would give him a son who would sit on the throne forever and rule. And as we come to 1 Kings 3, David has died, and his son Solomon now comes to the throne, the one who has all of this great insight. This is the man whom we're told in 1 Kings 3:3, he has the heart of his father David. And his father David had a heart after God. And so Solomon is continuing in the ways of his good father, though imperfect as he was. He sacrifices to God, he offers prayers, he seeks to bring the blessing to the nations. And while we can't cover all the details in verses 1 through 4 this morning, we want to see, how do you live a life that makes the right decisions? And if you're making the right decisions, how then can they have a lasting impact? And from these questions, I think what we can see from Solomon is how we can make right decisions and have a lasting impact, an impact that goes on into eternity, that makes a difference, that leaves a legacy of joy and greatness. And so what do we see, and how do we ask for the right things, and what difference do they make? Two things. First, I see from Solomon's life that we ought to ask for wisdom. We need to ask for wisdom from God. It seems that in response to Solomon's worship and his sacrifices, and regardless of how we understand that, the Lord comes and he responds to Israel and Solomon's worship with an offer. He comes and offers Solomon anything that he would ask for, he says in verse 5. Ask of me that which you want. He'll give it to him. And from this, what we hear is a God who is radically generous, a God who is abounding in what he gives. This is not a God who is stingy when he gives to his people, but rather he is a God who abounds in his good gifts to his children. And so he is radically generous. This is why, as a church, one of our values, we talk about it, is to be radically generous. To be radically generous in terms of not merely our finances, not merely with our time, not merely with our resources and abilities, but also in being radically generous towards one another. We've been seeking to do that as a church, and through this season where things have been so challenging and so difficult, where people have various opinions on almost everything that exists. We've tried to be radically generous to one another because this is the nature of our God. Our God is a God who is radically generous. He gives liberally, generously, abundantly to those who ask of him. And the response to a God who is radically generous ought to be what Solomon does. Solomon responds to the generosity of God by prayer. He's put into this deep sleep, we're told, and there's this miraculous moment. We don't understand it, but Solomon prays. God says, I'll give you whatever you ask. And Solomon begins by praying. But Solomon's prayer is very instructive for us in terms of how we ought to approach God. Instead of being those who approach God like he's some sort of candy dispenser, or that there are 3 wishes that can be made out for us, notice what Solomon does in verses 6 through 8. Solomon begins and says, "You have shown great and steadfast love to your servant David my father, because he walked before you in faithfulness and righteousness and in uprightness of heart toward you. And you have kept for him this great and steadfast love, and have given him a son to sit on his throne this day. And now, Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of David my father. Although I am but a little child, I do not know how to go out or to come in. And your servant is in the midst of your people, whom you have chosen, a great people, too many to be numbered or counted for multitude." In this, what Solomon begins to do is he begins to recount all of the faithfulness of God towards his promises. God is a promise-making God, and he is a promise-keeping God. In fact, the first promise that we hear that Solomon begins with is first the promise that God had made to his own father, David, in 2 Samuel 7, verses 12 and following, that David's legacy would continue. He'd have a son who'd sit on the throne forever, and that his house would be built. And Solomon says, Lord, here I am. I'm sitting on the throne, and I have to praise you. You've kept your promise to my father, David. But the reason that God keeps his promise, he recalls some language from Moses, this steadfast love and faithfulness, which recounts God's faithfulness to his own people when they were in the wilderness. And he recounts how God has been always the God of steadfast love and faithfulness. We see that there as he calls God the one who is faithful in righteousness, uprightness, and who has always been faithful in steadfast love. But he goes beyond that, and he also describes God as the one who has kept his promise not just to David and to Moses, but also, you see, to Abraham. He uses that language in verse 8, where he talks about the God who had said to Abraham, I'm going to give you descendants. They're going to be as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. Genesis 13, verse 16. God, you have kept your promise to Abraham, to Moses, and to David. That's the kind of God you are. You're a radically generous God. You remember your promises. And because you remember your promises, now I come to you. Now, what if we began our prayers in these ways? And we recounted the faithfulness of God. And we recounted his character. So often, doesn't prayer become a humdrum and something that just feels very task-oriented? It doesn't seem to move our hearts with faith and hope and love. Could part of the problem be how we start our prayers? So often we start our prayers from the posture of me. What do I need? And our needs are important, and it's good to ask God for all things. But when we begin with this human-centered view of prayer, it's amazing how it disrupts and disorients faith. What we need in prayer is to begin by recounting the very character of a God who is faithful, steadfast in love and mercy, who keeps promises. That when we have this in mind, what we find is that our prayers are fueled with faith in God. That we can ask great things of God because we have first begun with the character of God. And so Solomon prays not by giving his requests first, but by recounting the character of God, the promise-keeping God, and the impact that this has on prayer is great. Because not only does he recount God's promises, but he also recounts God's purposes. In verses 7 through 9, he recounts these purposes. He says, Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of David my father, although I am but a little child. I do not how to go out or come in. Your servant is in the midst of your people, whom you have chosen, a great people, too many to be numbered or counted for multitude. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to govern this? Your great people. And what Solomon prays in this is God's purposes. God's purposes for his people. His prayer request is not merely a selfish request. It is a self-giving. That in his request, that he might serve God's people. Why? Why does he pray this way? He prays first, he says, I'm young. I'm like a child, a young little child. 2, he says, I lack the experience. I don't have the kind of leadership or experience that is necessary for this task. And 3, this is a great people that need to be governed. It's a huge task. I'm like a child, I'm inexperienced, and the task is enormous. And in light of that, as Solomon prays, he's praying not merely for himself, but for God's purposes. That you, Lord, would grant your servant a discerning mind and understanding heart, that I could govern this, your chosen, your great people. And so as he asks for this, He asks a generous God that he might be able to discern good from evil. Now, we're going to come back to that phrase because it's very important. But God responds to this. Not only does Solomon pray in light of God's promises and in light of God's purposes, but God is pleased. He is pleased, we're told in verse 10, to grant this request. It pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this. And so what does God provide Solomon? He says, I'm going to give you exactly what you've asked for. You asked for, now notice what he didn't ask for. He didn't ask for wisdom technically. In verse 9, what he asks for is discernment between good and evil. Give your servant an understanding heart or mind, that I could discern good and evil, that I could govern your people well. And in these days, it's right for us as Christians to be praying for our government, that God would grant us a government that would be wise, that would discern good from evil. There are complex issues going on today that really none of us really want to be in governance, do we? When you've got to balance out the needs of health care and economic needs and rights and freedoms, these are incredibly complex issues. And we ought to pray, like Solomon prayed for, that God would grant leaders a wise and discerning heart to know good and evil. These are tough days. And every leader, regardless of political stripe or tribe, they need our prayers. They need to be honored. And it's good and right, as Paul will say in 1 Timothy 2, for us to pray for those governing officials, that we could live quiet and peaceful lives. This is pleasing to God our Savior. And when God hears those requests, it pleased him what Solomon had asked. And these are the requests that please God. And God is gracious and abounding, generous. He gives more than what Solomon could ever ask or imagine. Solomon didn't ask for the freedom over his enemies. He didn't ask for a long life. He didn't ask for a great name. He didn't ask for riches and success. What he asked for was discernment, an understanding heart or understanding mind, a hearing heart, hearing mind, that he might govern the people well, leading them through good and evil. And God grants that and more, giving him a great promise of peace and great prosperity. So Solomon really shows us that we all need to ask. We need to ask God for God's purposes in light of his character, and that we all ought to ask for wisdom. But the second thing that Solomon does is he not merely asks for wisdom, he uses wisdom. And you and I are called to use that same wisdom. In verses 16 through 28, which I didn't read this morning, we see that Solomon is immediately put to the test. Two women are brought before him, and they both have had young children, these babies. And in the night, one has died, and a woman whose baby died, she switches it with the baby that was alive. And the woman who has given birth to this child who has remained alive finds that her baby, it's not her baby, and she wakes up to a child that's dead. So they begin to argue over this living child. Whose really is it? And they both claim the right of this child. So they come to Solomon, and they plead their case. And as they plead their case, we're told, Solomon uses great wisdom to discern whose child this is. Well, if you're both arguing about whose child is the living child, then why don't we give you half of the living child each? That'll solve the problem. Both of you can have half. One half to this woman, one half to the other. And the one woman responds by saying, yeah, that's exactly what should be done. The woman whose child had died, and who has switched the children in the middle of the night. But for the woman whose child it was, she says, no, give that child to her. Let that child live. And Solomon can see through in that moment. With his great wisdom, he can see through the real heart of the issue. He discerns good and evil. He discerns the evil intentions, even in his own kingdom. And so he rightly gives the living child to the mother who would gladly give the child away. And in this, Solomon has an immediate impact. the impact that he has comes how? Because he comes to God, we're told in verse 9, give your servant therefore an understanding mind. It could also be translated an understanding heart or a hearing heart. The heart being the source of our affections, of our desires, of our longings, more than just the seat of our emotions. Give your servant the ability to discern good and evil. And what we hear in that phrase ought to echo back to us at the very beginning of the Bible story. That there was another king who was to discern between good and evil, and he was to come to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And when he was to come to that tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, it was an acknowledgement that he did not have wisdom in and of himself. Adam was to come to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This is why this tree was not for him to eat of. He was not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil for the simple fact that the knowledge of good and evil was not his to grasp onto, but it was to be given from above by God. That he was to come to God to discern good from evil. And like all other kings, he was to be the first king, but he failed in his task. Instead of discerning the evil of the serpent, what he did was, when he saw that the tree that he was not to eat from, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, was pleasing to the eyes, and it looked good, and it was desirous, he took and he ate it. And in Genesis 3:6, we're told that this was a tree of wisdom. And so Solomon here functions in the way that Adam fails to. Solomon is the true king, the king that where Adam failed to rule the kingdom of God in the Garden of Eden. Solomon rules faithfully. He rules faithfully by coming to God to discern good from evil, recognizing he doesn't have the ability. That the serpent who had tempted Adam was saying, you can have it. God's withholding the wisdom from you. Solomon recognizes, no, I don't have that wisdom. I'm just a young child. I don't know coming and going, and I need to govern this people well. So, Lord, grant me the discernment, the knowledge of good and evil. Give that wisdom from above to me. And as he was to discern it, it was a heart disposition that was attuned to God, a heart disposition that was solely devoted. Just as his father was devoted to the Lord, so Solomon has, we're told, a heart for God, a heart that wants to know good and evil, to walk in God's ways, to walk in his statutes, to keep his commands. Because this is the very essence of wisdom. It's not just knowing information, it is living skillfully in light of God's commands. That's what wisdom is. It's to live skillfully in all areas of life in terms of what God has commanded. And so as he receives this ability to discern good from evil, he has this kingly task to protect his kingdom, which immediately is put to test by these two women. A woman who wants to do evil and a woman who wants to do what's good. And Solomon then rightly acts where Adam had failed. But Solomon's wisdom was not just in the moment. It wasn't just for his lifetime. That while Solomon he's described in chapter 4, verse 20 as one of the greatest kings of Israel, chapter 4, verse 21 as one of the greatest in all the world, that in chapter 4, verse 34, the kings come from all of the world to this wise king who's never been like any other king. Solomon exercises a dominion, we're told in chapter 4, verse 20, 21, 24, and 34, that Adam was to. Adam was to have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and the flocks of the land, but he had failed because he wanted to grasp onto wisdom himself. But Solomon, recognizing he can't grasp onto wisdom, but wisdom has to be given to him, he now has the dominion that Adam never had. ruling. In chapter 4, that language in 20, 21, 24, 34, the language of dominion is very evident. That he has dominion from sea to sea, from the Euphrates all the way to Gaza, to the Mediterranean. He's got this huge expanse of land. He's having the dominion that Adam never had. And this is what wisdom does, is it gives the impact of the rule of God. And so Solomon then displays this wisdom by giving us a lot of our wisdom literature. The wisdom literature of the Bible it's in 5 books: Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs. These 5 books, the bulk of these books, are by David and by Solomon. Solomon, you see, he's this wise king who has received great instruction, and he wants the kingship to be passed on from generation to generation. If God had promised David that there would be one who would sit on the throne forever from David's line, then what does Solomon want to do? He wants to ensure that his wisdom is imparted to another generation, which is why Proverbs chapters 1 through 9 is the words of Solomon to his son. He wants to impart wisdom to his son so that the wisdom of God would continue in Israel. That his son wouldn't follow the loose lady, but follow the woman of wisdom. That Solomon is wanting to impart to his son the wisdom so he doesn't run with the gangs on the streets of Jerusalem, but that he would rule rightly. This is Proverbs 1 through 9. And the collection of sayings brought together in the book of Proverbs so that you would learn how to know God and live in light of God's wisdom. Solomon pulls these proverbs together. But recognizing that life is complicated, and while you can have nice pithy sayings, what do you do when life doesn't work out, when those sayings, those pithy sayings, are generally true but sometimes fall flat? The book of Ecclesiastes is of David's son, the king of Jerusalem, Solomon. And the book of Ecclesiastes really is this description of how do we find joy in the midst of a sin-filled world. How do we find joy in the life where we can pursue pleasure, we can pursue wealth, we can pursue fame, we can pursue success, and all of those things can be unsatisfying, like a chasing after the wind. It's like mist and vapor. And Solomon comes to the conclusion, fear God. In chapter 12 of Ecclesiastes, fear God. And by fearing God, there's great joy. But not only is there great joy, but there's a joy not only in living life, but there's a joy in loving, which is why the book of Song of Solomon, or the Song of Songs, it is the pinnacle of all songs. The Song of Songs is this testimony of love. This love that should have existed between Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. The book of the Song of Songs is full of Eden language. The language of steadfast love and faithfulness. And it is Solomon's expression of how we learn to love. It's not just the wisdom that's needed to guide and to govern. It's not just the wisdom to know how to enjoy life in the midst of sin. It's also the wisdom to know how to love in a world full of broken relationships. And in light of that, Solomon gives us the very words of God. And those words continue to give us an impact today. It's wisdom that still resounds. Train up a child in the way he should go, and in the end he will not depart from it. Good name is better than silver or gold. Both of those proverbs from Proverbs 22. Wine is a mocker and beer is a brawler, and whoever is led astray by them is not wise. Proverbs 17. All of these sayings of wisdom, all of these things, and so that we would learn how to live joyfully in light of who God is in all spheres of life, whether it's in work or family or in play, in rest or worship. And his legacy lives on. But even though we're to ask and use wisdom, ask for and use wisdom, the ultimate goal is not wisdom itself, but all of the Old Testament, as we have seen beginning from last September till June, and as we'll see as we go through the rest of the Old Testament story up until Christmas, is intended to show us and help us see the glory of Christ. The wisdom that God gives and imparts was not greatest in Solomon. We are told in Matthew 12, verse 42, that there is one who is greater than Solomon. Solomon, who is told he'd be great, there'd be no one like him in all of his time who'd have the wisdom that he has. There was one who was greater, who came with greater wisdom and greater insight and greater understanding, and his name is Jesus. And Jesus came and he walked this earth and he displayed the wisdom of God in how he lived and how he died, which is why the Apostle Paul can say in 1 Corinthians 1:30 that he has become for us the wisdom of God. That you want to see what God's wisdom looks like, you look to Jesus, and as you look to Jesus, you see the wisdom of God. But the wisdom of God doesn't look like the wisdom of men. In fact, the wisdom of God looks like foolishness to men, but God's foolishness, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1, is smarter than the wisdom of man. The foolishness of God is far greater than the wisdom of men. Men want to be risk averse. They want to manage situations. They want to control things. But the way that God works is that he sends his very own son, and he sends him to a cross, which looks like defeat. It looks like vulnerability. It looks like weakness, and yet it is the wisdom and the power and the righteousness of God. And it's all on display. That when we look at Jesus, we see wisdom in all of its purest form, so that we might know how we ought to live. And the way that we ought to live is not in light of seeking out wisdom as though we could get it ourselves, but to look to Christ, who is for us our wisdom, to confess that my greatest problem is I live for myself, that I'm selfish, that I want what I want. Which is why the Proverbs of the New Testament, the book of James, it says that if any of you lacks wisdom, James 1:5, let him ask of God, who gives liberally, generously. The God who poured out all wisdom to Solomon is the same God who says, ask of me and I will give it to you. You want my wisdom? I can impart it to you. But if you want God's wisdom, it can't be for your own sake. Solomon didn't seek the wisdom of God for his own sake, but for the sake of God's purposes and the sake of God's people. Which is why James can go on to say, not only should we ask God if we lack wisdom, but we should not be double-minded. Don't be a double-minded man, James 1:6. Don't be a double-minded man, asking like you want one thing, but you want to live for another. That your heart must be devoted to God. Just as David's heart was devoted to God, Solomon's heart devoted to God, let your heart be single-minded, not double-minded, so that you're tossed back and forth, but be single-minded, so that in your devotion that you would hear, as Proverbs 1 talks about, wisdom calling aloud in the streets, that you would seek and find wisdom. That this is where wisdom begins. It's in a dedication of the heart, as Proverbs 1:7 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And what the fear of the Lord is simply a reverence and devotion to God that is single-minded. It's not double-minded in wanting one thing and then wanting another. It is solely devoted to God. And when we have a heart and mind devoted to God, as Solomon prayed, give your servant a hearing heart that I might be able to discern good from evil, and by doing so I might be able to govern your people well. When we have that kind of heart, Lord, give me wisdom that I might love your people, that your people might rule well, that your people might live and love well. Then what we find is that the heart of Christ, who is vulnerable, who is weak, who is self-sacrificing, that looked like foolishness, is actually the very heart that gives you and me the wisdom to live here and now. We need the heart of Christ, that we might walk in his ways, that we might have his wisdom. And when we seek the Lord and we make it our sole focus, then what we find is, as James 3 says that in James 3:17, that the wisdom that comes from above is first of all pure and then peaceable and righteous, and whoever lives by it will produce a harvest of peace. That God grants His wisdom so that His people might live skillfully and joyfully as they seek Him. And when you do that, when you seek the wisdom that is from above, you won't be canceled after one season. You won't find that your reality show is here today and gone tomorrow. That there's more than 3 wishes that can be granted in an hour. That instead, that when you live in light of the wisdom of God, that what you receive is wisdom that has a lasting impact and legacy now and forever. That you can impart that wisdom to others, that you can live in light of that wisdom, that you can make a difference, not so that your name would be great, which is double-mindedness, but that His name would be great. And when His name is made great, then the legacy that you live and the legacy that you pass on is an enduring legacy from generation to generation, because you make much of Him who is the wisdom of God, who bestows that wisdom. And as He gives you that wisdom, there is that eternal impact, so that you might never be canceled, but that you might live for Him. And by living for Him, that you might love Him and enjoy Him as you seek Him with all of your heart.